Hello, welcome back to Going Walkabout. There's still one main view that isn't SwiftUI, and today we work on that. It's the trip list. The trip list shows you the trips that you've created and the trips that you'll follow. And it has some logic that the most recent updated trip will be on top. So it's your main navigation point into the application. From there you move on to a trip, to maintain, to view, to do whatever you want. Now that list was still UIKit and it needs some update to SwiftUI. Today we work on that. So let's dive into it. This is the result what I have so far. As you can see, it shows the trips, it shows images, and one of the changes I did with the previous one, I always make sure there's 4 placeholders for images, because in the past if there was only one image it would show really big and I didn't like that. So now you can see if there's 4 pictures, the most recent one it shows. If there are only 3, it shows square placeholders at the end and it looks a lot nicer. I also modernized the look a little bit, but that is something I will move through the application in general, but that's it. Now of course everything here is a row, and that is encapsulated here in a trips row view. And that trips row view of course has some logic to do calculations on the width, and that's done here in the row view model. And the row view model, it gets initialized, it gets a width, it takes a margin away, it does a little bit of messaging in case the trip isn't started yet. I also need to show that because there's a placeholder but there's no content. And then I need to calculate those media sizes for the square things. And I know the aspect ratios of the images, so I can add all the aspect ratios, calculate the width, and then I can create relative width for each image, and that's what is done here. That what is done in this trip here is used, it goes through the media sizes and it will calculate it. If there's a trip it will show an image, and otherwise it will do a rectangular with a gray background. And that's about it. It's fairly straightforward, works, it's nice, it's done. And then in the trip view, I basically have just a list with the 4 each that comes from my view model, trip users, and I show the row view. But one of the important parts here is that when I show these trips, it's all about efficiency. I use Firebase in the backend. I want to reduce my reads, so I have a list with followers. That list with followers also contains the most recent images, etc. So with a single query, I can retrieve this list. It's fast, it scales, and there's a limited number of reads necessary to do that. But the disadvantage is that I don't have the full trip info. So if I would click on this row and I would navigate to the trip, in the old logic I would pass in the trip user, and I had a lot of logic in my trip view to determine what was the source. Did I come from the explore screen when I did have trip info, or did I come from the trip view where I didn't have trip info, etc. And I wanted to change that. So I wanted to make sure that my trip view always receives a trip. So it means that when I click here on one of these rows, I need to do the logic to do and fetch the correct trip before I do the navigation. And that's what I did here. So I built a stack, a Z stack, with a hidden navigation link. And this is the recommended way for Apple to do that in lower iOS versions. I know we have navigation stacks, but I cannot use them yet because I'm bound to iOS 14 for now. So I have a hidden navigation link, and then I have my list. And on my list I have, for each I do a button. So I wrap the row in the button here. And I select a trip with the information that I have in my view model. So in my view model now, and this is important, I get into my selected trip, I check if I have a trip ID, if you're not authenticated, because the list can also be accessible for public users and you don't want anything to happen. And now I fetch my trip based on the trip ID from the follower, and I set my selected trip here as a property, a published property on my view model, and I set the to navigation is true. And this is what then triggers the navigation here in the trip view, because it selects the trip when I press the button, and then is active is do navigation. The active is false because there was no navigation, so it's just being ignored. But as soon as I've selected the trip, this selected trip has a value and it becomes active, and then it will do the navigation. So this is a very good way that if you have a list and you want to do some action, perform some action before you actually do the navigation. I explained this before because I had the same logic in my notification screen, but I think it's worth mentioning again that this is a very important part of doing navigations. And if you have a list, you navigate, you want to perform an action, this is the way to do that. And that's what I've implemented here, and I can do the navigation. So let's go and run this, because then we can actually see it with real data and the real navigation and not in the preview anymore. So let's run the application. Now we have the trips here. We can go into my trip and we nicely navigate to the trip. And we can go back and we can go to another trip. And we will see it is the correct trip selected, and we can go down. Now, there's one thing that is different from how it used to be in the past, because the old trip view was ignoring the bottom save area, so it would actually not show the tab bar. But for some reason, I don't get that working correctly in SwiftUI, so I always have my tab bar. And to be honest, I don't mind it very much. Now, you also see the new layout, of course, here with an image that isn't there as a recent image, so it works. The only thing I notice, and I still need to figure that out a little bit, if you look here, if I start scrolling, it doesn't scroll that smooth as the old list was doing. And I don't know if it's the simulator or it's the real device, but this is something that I notice in working that isn't that smooth. So maybe I need to work on also replacing the whole tab view to SwiftUI, and maybe that will improve that behavior as well. But for now, I have my new list view. I can do the proper navigation to the correct trip. I can show that all this works. So it continues to become a more and more SwiftUI. The next major thing to address is, if I'm here, is this trip header view, because that is still UIKit with a lot of storyboard and logic. So that's the next thing on my agenda, is to work on this trip header view, so that I can also move that part into SwiftUI. And when I've done that, I have covered all my main views. I still have UIKit in terms of navigation and tab bars, and for the iPad with my split view controller thing. But the majority of the user interface, so what you actually see, is then SwiftUI, what is a good milestone and a nice way to continue. That's it for today. I hope you like it. If you like it, please like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, subscribe anyway, because the next one might be better for you. I'll thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.